They told me it was just a simple job. Photograph some old recipes for a small-town bakery closing after 60 years. I needed the money, and the address was a crooked house on the edge of town with a faded sign that read, "Mabel's Pies" in flaking red paint. The door stuck when I pushed it open. The bell over it didn't ring. It sighed, like a thing trying to remember how. Inside smelled like something I couldn't name at first. Warm flour and butter, yes, but beneath that a thin, cold ribbon of iron and old cloth. Sunlight fell through a high window, cutting the dust into pale islands. Shelves bowed under jars and tins. A radio in the corner hummed a station that sounded like it belonged to another decade. I set up my gear on a long counter scarred by knives and years and told myself to keep it clinical. I told myself I wasn't here to judge history. They left me alone. They said they'd be back in an hour. I started with wide shots, the counter, the battered mixer, the recipe index cards tied with twine. Then I turned to the cooling rack in the center of the room and found the pies. At first I thought the light was playing tricks. Round, golden crusts sat like coins, each crimped edge precise, each surface blistered and glossy. But the crusts were not smooth. They carried impressions, indentations that could have been knots from cloth, except they arranged themselves into the geometry of a face. A nose, soft and flattened, closed lids smoothed over like dough folded to hide sorrow. I told myself, photographers' eyes invent patterns. I told myself what I saw was only an old woman's way of shaping pastry into novelty. The second pie made me stop breathing. The crust had the swell of a temple and the tiny, surprising texture of a closed eyelash. A dark bruise under one lid looked like a shadowed iris. When I leaned closer, the scent deepened. Not just butter, but copper, and something sweeter, sugar, clotted with a faint, unmistakable undertone of iron. I touched the crust with the back of my hand because my brain wanted proof. It was warm. The warmth didn't come from an oven. It seemed to pulse faintly, as if the pies held a heartbeat beneath their shells. My fingers came away tacky, and for a second, I swore I felt a tremor through the wood, like a breath that had been held too long. I propped my camera and took a picture, mechanical and clean, trying to anchor myself in work. The flash grabbed the rings on the crust and the tiny, impossible pores of whatever lay beneath. When I reviewed the shot on the screen, every pie's mouth was slack, solemn, and one of the faces looked almost, not quite, as if it were exhaling. I remember laughing then, a short, high sound that didn't belong to me. I remember the silence after, heavy and absolute, as if the room had been waiting to see how I would react. And then, while I was still pretending this was only a strange, old kitchen, something small and wet traced the inside of my wrist. The wetness on my wrist felt like someone had pressed their thumb there and left a smear of something warm and metallic. I raised my hand to my face and tasted it without meaning to. Salt and copper, like a mouth I didn't want to imagine. My pulse tightened. I told myself again, this was nonsense. Old kitchens gather smells. My imagination fills in faces. But the room had changed. The light was flatter, as if someone had drawn a curtain across the sun. I set the camera down, but kept it pointed at the pies, because work gives you rules to hold on to. My hands shook as I adjusted settings. When I flicked through the photos I had already taken, the faces on the screen looked the same as the crust at first, closed, harmless. Then I noticed something I hadn't when I shot them. Faint, concentric lines on the lids, like dried tears. In one frame, a slit at the corner of a mouth caught the flash and showed a thread of something darkened and glistening. I swallowed hard. Footsteps creaked in the hallway outside, but not toward the door. They circled the house, light, then away. The radio in the corner, which had been a dull hum, shifted station like a living thing shifting breath. The announcer's voice fractured into a list, not songs, but names, read slow and precise. I felt the room lean in to hear. One name stopped me so hard, the coffee in my hand wobbled. Ellen March, missing since '83. The name collided with my memory. There had been a faded poster by the bakery's chalkboard the size of a palm, with a photograph I'd not seen until then. Ellen's eyes on the poster stared out with a familiarity that made my mouth go cold. She had the same blunt nose as one of the pies. The same mouth. Panic doesn't arrive all at once. It unfolds with small betrayals. I told myself to leave. I moved toward the door and found it slower than it should have been. as if the wood resisted me with a polite, bureaucratic lethargy. I fumbled the knob and it turned, but the hallway beyond looked wrong. Longer, lined with jars and cards and photographs of faces I recognized in fragments. A child's missing poster, a funeral notice, a wedding snapshot with the woman's face crudely edited out. Each image felt like a breadcrumb trail, leading me back to the cooling rack. When I glanced at the pies again, one had shifted. Not a dramatic roll, but a tilt, an angle suggesting attention. The crust around a temple had softened, as though whatever lay beneath had taken a breath. The sound was almost nothing, a tiny, wet exhale that made the hair along my arms stand up. My camera, sitting between us, flashed without me touching it. The last picture saved showed the faces turned toward me, eyes sealed but aligned, as if they'd been waiting for the camera to decide their gaze. Then, through the radio's crackle, a voice came that wasn't on any station I knew. It spoke my name, slow and savory, like someone savoring a secret. My throat closed. I wasn't certain which frightened me more, that my name had been uttered or that the voice ended with a soft, crusty sound that could have been a laugh or a mouth opening. I tried to move, but the house had learned how to hold me. The door that had been so stubborn before now latched with a soft, final click when I pushed. The hallway beyond offered only a deeper, darker corridor, lined with more jars, more missing posters, more faces with mouths stitched into pastry. My breath came shallow and fast, flour in my lungs, the metallic tang on my tongue like someone had answered me with a grin made of coins. The radio crawled to life again, low and patient. The voice read names like a roll call, slower now, reverent. My name came last. It didn't just say it, it folded my letters into a recipe. "Add skin, 1 tender cup," it murmured. My camera felt heavy in my hands, suddenly the only honest object in a house of lies. I raised it and tried to photograph the pies, to prove they were real, to show someone that this was happening. The little screen blinked back at me, then froze as if the light itself had decided to keep the image holy. One pie split, not violently, more like a sigh of pastry giving up its secret. A seam opened along the crust and a thin, translucent film stretched and broke, and from it came a scent that was not baking anymore, but something that had been kept in sugar and iron for decades. It was a voice, smaller than the radio, closer to the wood, a sound sown from breath and crust. "Please." I could hear every vowel like a grain of sand, sliding down a throat. For a second, I understood that pleading wasn't for mercy, it was an invitation. The faces did not want to be eaten. They wanted the company. They wanted someone to remember the shape of them. When I stepped back, the counter pressed against my palms like a friend with 2 strong hands. The pies leaned, as if toward conversation, as if toward confession. A smear of dark on one lid looked uncannily like the crescent of a smile. Panic gave way to something stranger. Pity, then a ridiculous, horrible curiosity. I reached out. My fingertips brushed crust and warmth licked my skin. Not cold now, but the exact warmth of a bedside, of being held. The house exhaled through the vents, and I felt my will thin like dough under a rolling pin. I thought of the missing names and the photographs of Ellen March and the bride with no face, and a slow, absolute understanding settled in. This place collected faces the way other places collected spoons, preserving them in sugar and memory. I stepped toward the open pie as if toward a mirror. For a heartbeat, I saw my own face reflected in the glossy fat of the crust, a smear, a suggestion. And with the next breath, the room closed like a lid. Hands, neither mine nor wholly other, took the camera from me. The flash popped once, capturing something that would be described later as proof or hallucination, depending on who survived to tell it. The last thing I remember is the taste, not of the pies but of my own name, salted and sweet, folding over my tongue. They saved the last slice for me.
Subscribe to Horror Story Bar.